The morning Dura Gorehorn arrived at Cyrus Dalton's homestead, she came with nothing but a clan contract, a bruised jaw, and the absolute certainty that she would be gone before the first snowfall. The arrangement had been brokered by Elder Moswick of Thornfield Crossing, the only settlement within 3 days' ride of the Gorehorn clan's territory. A piece of frontier borderland so raw and wind-scoured that even the wolves looked thin out there. The deal was simple and cold as iron in January. The Gorehorn clan needed trade access through the Thornfield Valley, and Thornfield's most isolated homesteader, Cyrus Dalton, needed labor he could not afford to hire. Elder Moswick had framed it as a bride arrangement because that was the only contract an orc clan would honor with a human, the only framework that carried enough weight on both sides to prevent either party from simply walking away when the work got hard. Dura had not been consulted. She had been informed. She was 23 years old, the third daughter of clan chief Ragnoth Gorehorn, and she had been told by her father with the flat, unsentimental practicality that orc chieftains used for everything from declaring war to choosing grazing routes, that she would spend one full harvest season at the Dalton homestead, that she would work and be housed in exchange for the clan's passage rights, and that when the season ended she would return home with her honor intact and the contract fulfilled. 1 season. That was the promise she had made herself on the 3-day walk through the valley. She arrived on a Tuesday in late spring, when the last frost had barely released its grip on the high meadows, and the air still carried a bite that made your ears ache. Dura stood at the end of a rutted wagon track, one hand gripping a canvas travel pack, and looked at the homestead that was supposed to define her next 4 months. It was not impressive. A log cabin with a sod roof, a listing barn, a vegetable plot that clearly hadn't seen attention since autumn, a split-rail fence with 2 posts knocked sideways, and a mule regarding her from across the fence with the expression of an animal that had stopped caring about most things. A cold spring trickled along the eastern edge of the property, and beyond the cabin, the mountain ridge rose dark and forested against a pearl-gray sky. The homestead sat alone in a wide, shallow valley, with Thornfield crossing a full half-day's walk south and nothing at all to the north but wilderness. She was wearing what she always wore for travel, a fitted leather bodice, deep brown and well-oiled, laced up the front over a cream linen undershirt that was tucked into snug dark travel leggings, a wide belt cinched at her waist with a copper clasp, and knee-high field boots that had walked 1,000 miles and still held their shape. The leather bodice was cut to follow the lines of her figure, practical but feminine, the kind of garment made by someone who understood that an orc woman needed both freedom of movement and something that fit rather than hung. Her green skin was a deep, forest shade, warm rather than cold, and her dark hair was pulled back in a thick braid that fell between her shoulder blades. She had small lower tusks, delicate by orc standards, barely jutting past her lower lip, and her eyes were a striking amber gold, currently narrowed with the particular expression of someone doing hard mental arithmetic about whether they have made a catastrophic mistake. She had not expected the man who came out of the cabin to be young. Cyrus Dalton was 26. He came through the front door wiping grease off his hands with a rag, and he stopped when he saw her standing at the end of his track, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He was tall and lean in the way frontier men got, not built for show, but built for the kind of work that didn't stop. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week, and brown eyes that were, Dura noticed with some suspicion, entirely free of the contempt she had been steeling herself against for 3 days. He looked tired, and a little relieved, and more than a little uncertain. "You must be from the Gorehorn clan," he said. "Dura Gorehorn," she said, because she had decided before she came that she would introduce herself by name and not by arrangement. She was not going to be the orc bride if she could avoid it. She was a person. "Cyrus Dalton," he said, and he walked down the track toward her and extended his hand the way humans did, and when she looked at it for a moment without taking it assessing, calibrating. He didn't pull it back or make it awkward. He just waited. She shook it. His grip was firm and his hands were calloused from handle work, and he didn't squeeze harder than he needed to, which she noted as a point in his favor. "Long walk from clan territory," he said. "3 days," she said. "You hungry?" She was. She was extremely hungry. "I could eat." He turned back toward the cabin and she followed him, and that was how it started, not with ceremony, not with the formal recitation of the contract terms she had half expected, but with a man who asked a simple question and meant it. The inside of the cabin was clean in the way that spaces get when someone lives alone and has one system for everything. There was a wood stove at the far wall, a workbench along one side stacked with tools in reasonable order, a single plank table with 2 chairs, and a sleeping loft accessed by a ladder. A second bedroll had been laid out near the stove, on a raised wooden frame that served as a cot, with a wool blanket folded at the foot. Dura looked at it and looked at the loft, and Cyrus said, without her having to ask, "I sleep in the loft, that's your space. The blanket's clean, I made sure of it." She set her pack down on the cot and turned to find him already at the stove, adding wood. "There's a contract," she said, because someone needed to say it. "I've read it," he said without turning around. 4 months through the harvest season. You work the homestead with me. I provide board and food, and the clan gets the valley passage rights." He straightened and looked at her then, and there was something careful in his expression, something deliberate. "I want to say something about that if you'll let me." She crossed her arms. "Say it." "I didn't know the clan was going to send. I didn't know the terms would be framed the way they were. Moswick called it a bride arrangement, and the clan agreed to it, but I want you to know that I don't think of it that way. You're not here to be a bride. You're here because we both needed something, and this was the way the deal got made." He paused. "You can leave any time you want. The passage rights are good regardless. I'm not going to hold you to anything that makes you feel like a prisoner." Dura looked at him for a long moment. Her amber eyes did not soften particularly, because she had not survived in a border clan by being quickly moved by kind words. "If you're not going to hold me to the contract," she said carefully, "then what do you need from me?" "Help with the homestead," he said simply. "The south field needs breaking before planting season ends. The barn roof is halfway to falling in. I've got fence line that needs replacing before I can bring in more livestock." He gestured around vaguely. "I've been doing this alone for 2 years, and it's about 1 season behind where it should be. I could genuinely use the help if you're willing to give it." She thought about this. "And if I decide to leave before the season ends?" "Then you leave," he said. "I'll still hold up the passage rights agreement. That's between me and Moswick and your clan chief. It's not contingent on you." That surprised her more than anything else had. She had expected leverage. She had expected the agreement to be the chain. "You would do that," she said. "Just give them the rights." "I said I would," he shrugged. "I don't break my word." She studied him for another long moment, and then she uncrossed her arms, which was the closest she was going to get right then, to telling him that he had passed some kind of test she hadn't announced she was administering. "I'll stay the season," she said, "and I'll work, but I want to be clear I pull my own weight. I don't need managing." "Wouldn't dream of it," he said, and something very close to a smile appeared on his face before he turned back to the stove to finish making the meal. The first weeks were a negotiation conducted entirely in labor. They established, without discussion, a rhythm that suited them both. Dura rose before dawn by habit. Orc clan started work with the first gray light, and Cyrus woke not long after, and they would share a brief, mostly silent breakfast of porridge or flatbread before splitting to the morning's tasks. She was a tireless worker. He had expected that, perhaps, given what he knew of orc physical capability, but what he had not expected was how efficient she was, how much she understood about land and soil and structural repair that he didn't. She looked at the listing barn and said, "The post is healed, not broken. You don't need to replace it. You need to brace it and pack the base." She was right. It saved him 3 days of work. She looked at the south field and asked him where his water access was, and when he showed her the spring, she said, "You could cut a channel here and gravity feed a strip of the field. You wouldn't need to carry water by bucket all summer." He looked at the slope, and at the spring, and at her, and said, "I've been buckets for 2 years." "I know," she said, and that was not said unkindly. They cut the channel together over 2 days, him digging and her shaping and packing the banks, and when they opened the head gate and the water ran true along the cut, she stood with her hands on her hips and watched it and allowed herself a small, private satisfaction that he happened to be watching her face at the time. "You've done this before," he said. "Clan has irrigation in the summer grazing grounds," she said. "My mother was the one who planned it. I helped her dig it when I was 12. It was the first personal thing she had offered, and she said it lightly, as if it didn't matter, but he received it with the attentiveness of someone who understood that it did. "Your mother sounds like a practical woman," he said. "She was," said Dura, past tense, and she moved on to the next task, and he didn't press. But that evening, when she was sitting on the step of the cabin in the late light sharpening her field knife, she sharpened it every evening. It was a habit she found calming. She heard him come out and sit down beside her on the step without asking, at a respectful distance, and he had 2 mugs of something warm and he set one beside her without making a production of it. She picked it up. It was tea with something sweet in it, honey, she thought. "It's just clover honey from the trading post in Thornfield," he said, as if he'd guessed she was trying to identify it. "I know it's not great tea. It's the best I've got." "It's fine," she said, and it was more than fine. It was warm and it was offered freely, and nobody had offered her anything freely in a long time that didn't come attached to an obligation. They sat there until the light went fully and the mountain ridge became a black shape against stars, and the spring made its small sound in the dark, and neither of them spoke much, but neither of them went inside, and when she finally rose to take her cot she said, "Good night, Cyrus," using his first name for the first time, and he said, "Good night, Dura," and both of them pretended that was a small thing. The trouble started the 3rd week, when they went to Thornfield Crossing for supplies. It was a Saturday market day, and the road south was busy with wagons and walkers, and the first problem was the looks. Dura had lived on the border of human territory her whole life, and she had been looked at before, that particular sliding, evaluating gaze that human strangers used when they saw an orc woman, assessing threat level, calculating distance, deciding whether disgust was worth expressing openly. She had developed over the years an exterior as weathered as river rock. She let the looks roll off. She kept walking. The second problem was that Thornfield Crossing on market day was a tight, packed thing, 24 stalls around a central yard, the general trading post on one side and the tavern on the other, townspeople and farmers and drovers all crowded together in the kind of proximity that made people territorial. Cyrus walked beside her at the same pace. He walked everywhere, unhurried and unbothered, and she could feel the ripple of attention moving ahead of them as the crowd registered what they were seeing. They made it to the grain merchant's stall without incident, and Cyrus was arranging a sack of seed corn while Dura was examining a bolt of waxed canvas he needed for the barn roof, when a man came up beside her and said, loud enough to carry, "You lost, Greenskin. Orc territory's 3 days north." She had her response ready. She always had it ready, but she didn't have to use it. Because Cyrus turned from the grain merchant's counter without any particular hurry and said, in a voice that was conversational but clear as a bell, "She's with me, Fletcher. She's working my homestead." Fletcher was a broad man, red-faced, with the look of someone who drank more than was good for him and liked audiences. He had a couple of friends behind him, and they were all watching. The market square had gone several degrees quieter. "Working your homestead," Fletcher repeated, loading the phrase with exactly the implication he intended. "That's right," said Cyrus, and now he had stepped between Fletcher and Dura, not aggressively. His hands were at his sides, not raised but physically, placing himself in the gap with the calm certainty of someone who had decided where they were standing and wasn't going to be moved from it. "We need canvas and the seed corn and the salt blocks, and then we're going to be on our way, and I'd appreciate it if you let us shop in peace." "Dalton, you're bringing an orc into the market, into the public market," said Cyrus. "On market day." "Yes, I am." He paused. "Is there a rule against that, Fletcher? Because I've read the Thornfield Town Charter and there isn't one. If there is, show it to me. Otherwise, I'd like to finish my shopping." Fletcher's friends were looking at each other. The grain merchant behind the counter was looking at his boots. The crowd that had gathered, and there was a crowd now, a loose ring of townspeople who had drifted over to see what was happening, was a mixed thing. Some faces hard, some merely curious. A few that Dura caught something she almost didn't recognize in, a guarded, private sympathy. Fletcher wanted to press it. She could see it in the set of his jaw. But Cyrus was a local, and he had a calm, unblinking quality in that moment that was difficult to steamroll, and eventually Fletcher made a dismissive sound and turned away, and his friends followed. Cyrus turned back to the bolt of waxed canvas. "How many feet do you think we need?" he said, as if the last 30 seconds hadn't happened. Dura's jaw was tight. She was deciding something. 16 feet, she said, "and I want you to know that I could have handled that myself." "I know you could," he said. "Then why did you?" "Because you shouldn't have to," he said simply. "Not when I'm standing right there." She stared at the bolt of canvas. Her throat was doing something it did not often do. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "Of course," he said, and called over the merchant to measure out the canvas, and that was that. The walk home from Thornfield was 3 hours, and they spent the first hour in silence that was less uncomfortable than it would have been a week earlier. Cyrus carried the heavier pack without making a point of it, and Dura carried the other one, and somewhere in the second hour she said, "Has it always been like that in Thornfield?" "Since the border wars, mostly," he said. "People lost people. They remember it by who scared them." "My clan lost people too," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't think loss belongs to one side." He was quiet a moment. "My father fought in the border skirmishes 20 years ago. He never talked about it much. But he always said the worst part wasn't the fighting. He said the worst part was being afraid all the time, and how fear makes you into someone you don't want to be." Dura walked in silence for a while, digesting this. "Your father sounds like an unusual man," she said finally. "He was something," Cyrus agreed. "He died 4 years ago, fever, nothing heroic. I've been running the homestead since." "Alone," she said. "Alone," he confirmed. She thought about that 4 years of that cabin, that mountain ridge, that lonely spring, and no one. She thought about the 2 chairs at the table, and realized with a small shock that they had both been used every day, that there had always been 2 chairs at that table, and she had assumed it was left from before, but maybe Cyrus had added the second one when he received word that someone was coming, and maybe he had done it with a particular care that she had not yet given him enough credit for. She did not say any of this, but she thought it. The second month changed things. It changed things partly because of the fence, and partly because of the rain, and partly because of what happened when Cyrus hurt his hand. The fence came first. The western boundary fence needed replacing, not 1 post but a full 100 yards of it, rotted through at the bases, and it was the kind of job that, done right, took 2 people working in genuine coordination. Cyrus had a method and Dura had a different method, and for the first 2 days they worked in parallel, each doing it their own way, and the fence was crooked. On the 3rd day Dura stopped and said, "This isn't working." "Agreed," said Cyrus. "Your holes are too shallow," she said. "In clay soil, if you don't go deep, frost heave will push the posts up in winter. Your spacing is too narrow for the kind of wire I have," he said. "If you go that tight with 5-strand wire, you're wasting half the material." They looked at each other. "Your depth," she said. "My spacing." "Done," he said. And after that they worked together in a way that stopped being 2 people doing the same job in proximity and became something more like a real partnership, one digging while the other set and packed, switching without being asked, learning each other's rhythm and the way each of them naturally moved. She noticed that he was methodical to the point of almost being compulsive. Every post tamped exactly 7 times, every wire stretched to the same tension. He noticed that she had an intuitive read on the land, that she adjusted for the slope and the drainage without seeming to think about it. By the end of the fence job, they were finishing each other's tasks without asking, and it felt, improbably, easy. The rain came at the end of the 6th week, 3 days of it, the kind of late spring downpour that turned the wagon track to soup and flooded the low corner of the south field. They worked in it, because the work didn't stop for rain, and by the end of the 2nd day, they were both soaked through and mud-splattered and laughing at the state of each other in a way that felt sudden and uncalculated, the kind of laughter that arrived before you could decide not to let it. She had mud along her jaw and in her braid. He had mud on his ear, which she pointed out, and he wiped at it and got the wrong side, and she pointed again and finally reached over and took his chin and turned his face to the right angle and wiped it herself with the edge of her sleeve, and then realized what she was doing and let go, and they were both very aware for a moment of how close they were standing. "Thank you," he said, a little low. "You had mud on your ear," she said. "I did," he said. They went inside and she changed into dry clothes behind the curtain she'd hung from a rafter for privacy, and he climbed to the loft to change. And when they came back together at the table for the evening meal, there was something between them that was new and a little electric, and neither of them named it. The hand was the third thing. Cyrus was splitting firewood one afternoon near the end of the 2nd month. Dura was inside working on mending a piece of harness for the mule, and she heard the sharp sound of something going wrong, and came out to find him sitting on the chopping block holding his left hand against his shirt. The axe head had glanced off a knot and taken a long cut across 3 of his fingers. It was not catastrophic, she could see that immediately, but it was deep enough to need cleaning and binding, and he had gone a little white. "Let me see," she said. "I'm fine, you are not fine. Let me see." He let her take his hand, and she examined the cut with the no-nonsense thoroughness of someone who had dealt with clan injuries her whole life, training wounds, hunt injuries, the occasional wall-building accident. The cut was clean and long. It needed pressure and wrapping, and it would close itself. She brought him inside and sat him at the table and fetched the small kit he kept on the workbench shelf. She had taken note of where he kept things, as a matter of general competence, and she cleaned the cut with spirits from a small brown bottle, which made him hiss through his teeth, and then she packed it and wrapped it with the efficient, firm certainty of someone who had done this many times. His hand was large and calloused in hers. She was aware of this in a way that was new. "You've done field medicine," he said. "Someone has to do it in a clan," she said, focused on the wrapping. "Thank you," he said. He was watching her face while she worked. "Do not thank me for patching a wound you gave yourself," she said, "but it came out less severe than she intended. Would you prefer I just bleed?" "I would prefer you use the mallet for the knots and the axe for the straight grain," she said, "like I mentioned 2 weeks ago." "You did mention it," he said. "I was wrong not to listen." She tied off the wrapping and looked up then, and found that his face was closer than she'd reckoned, because they were both bent over his hand on the table, and his brown eyes were warm and unguarded, and looking right at her with something she could not immediately categorize as anything but very intense attention. She sat back. "Keep it dry for 2 days," she said. "I will," he said. That night he made dinner instead of her taking the turn because she had his hand to spare, and he made it badly. It was scorched grain porridge with a piece of dried venison that was about as appetizing as a boot, and she ate it anyway. And when he apologized for the cooking, she said, "I've had worse," which was true, but the warmth in her voice when she said it was something new, and they both heard it. The season was supposed to end. She had said 1 season. She had promised herself 1 season. The trouble was that by the time summer hit its full, blazing height, and the south field was green and growing, and the barn roof was solid, and the fence was straight, and the channel ran clear, and the mule had developed an attitude of guarded respect toward Dura that it had apparently never extended to Cyrus. She had stopped thinking about leaving. She didn't notice it was happening until the day she caught herself planning the autumn harvest schedule in her head, automatically, the way you did when you intended to be somewhere. She went still at her work that day. She was at the vegetable garden, staking the bean vines, and she stared at the beans for a while. And then she looked at the cabin and the barn and the straight new fence and the channel running silver in the afternoon light, and she thought, oh, this is a problem. She had not planned for this. She had planned for one season. She had planned to leave with her honor and her distance intact, to go back to the clan with the contract fulfilled, and the certainty that she had not let herself be swayed by a human homestead and a human man who made bad tea and good decisions. But there it was. He came out of the barn in the afternoon light and he saw her standing in the garden not working, and he stopped. "You all right?" "Fine," she said. "Just thinking." "About?" She looked at him for a long moment, at the easy way he stood, at the way the summer light fell on his face, at the 2-week-old scar across his left fingers that had healed clean and straight because she had wrapped it right. "The harvest schedule," she said. "I was thinking about the harvest schedule." A careful look crossed his face. "Something quiet and complex. Season ends in 8 weeks, he said. "I know," she said. "You've made plans to go back to the clan." She looked at the beans. "I haven't made plans at all," she said, and she meant it as a simple statement of fact, but it landed between them with a weight that made both of them not speak for a moment. "I think," Cyrus said very carefully, "that I should tell you something." "Tell me." "I don't want you to go," he said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without maneuvering, without the hedging and cushioning that some people used when they were afraid of the response. "Just, I don't want you to go. I want to be honest with you about that because you deserve honesty. Not because I expect anything from you or because I want to hold you to anything. Just because it's true and you should know it." She stared at the beans for a long, long moment. "Cyrus," she said finally. "Yes. You make terrible tea." He blinked. "I know. And you nearly took off 3 fingers because you couldn't remember which wood needs the mallet. That's also true. And you sang to the mule last Thursday when you thought I was asleep, and the mule did not enjoy it, and neither did I. He was very quiet for a second, and then, I didn't know you were awake." "I was awake," she said. She turned to look at him, and something in her expression had shifted, become less guarded in a way that felt like stepping off a ledge she had been standing on for 2 months. "I don't know what I am going to tell my father," she said. "He is going to have a great deal of opinions." Cyrus looked at her, really looked at her with all that careful warmth that she had been cataloging for weeks and refusing to name. "What are you saying, Dura?" "I am saying," she said, "that I was just thinking about the harvest schedule, and there is apparently a reason for that." He crossed the garden to her then, stepping carefully between the bean stakes, which was so perfectly characteristic of him even in a moment like this. He would not trample the bean stakes, and he stopped in front of her and reached out, and his hand was very slow, and he tucked a loose strand of her dark hair behind her ear with a touch so gentle that it made her breath catch, and he said quietly, "Stay." She reached up and took his scarred hand before he could lower it and held it, just held it, at the side of her face. "One more season," she said, "and then we will figure out the rest." "One more season," he agreed, and his smile was the kind that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners, and it was absolutely devastating, and she decided right then that she was deeply in trouble. The next thing she decided was to tell him about her mother, because it had been sitting in her since the first week, and she had been carrying it like a stone in her boot. She told him that night at the fire outside, where they had taken to sitting on summer evenings when the cabin held too much heat. She told him that her mother had died 3 winters ago, a fever like his father, and that her mother had been the person in the clan who believed in building things rather than fighting for them. Her mother had been the one who argued for the trading agreements, for the channel irrigation, for sending Dura to help at the school in the border settlement when Dura was 16. Dura's mother had been the reason Dura knew how to read both the common script and the Orc clan runes, and how to negotiate a contract, and how to look at a piece of land and understand what it needed. She would have known, Dura said, looking at the fire, what to do about this. "About us," Cyrus said. "About all of it," Dura said. "The clan, my father, the contract, whether any of it is wise." "What do you think she would have said?" Dura was quiet for a while, and the fire popped, and somewhere in the dark the spring murmured over its stones. "She would have said that wisdom is a fine thing," Dura said finally, "but that it doesn't keep you warm at night." Cyrus laughed, a real one, surprised and genuine, and she felt it in her chest like a struck bell, the warm resonance of it. And she turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her. And the firelight was doing something very particular to the way his eyes looked. And without thinking about it, she leaned and he leaned, and the first kiss was tentative and questioning and then steady and sure. And it tasted like wood smoke and the last of the clover honey tea. And it was, she thought, extremely inconvenient how right it felt. He pulled back first, just far enough to look at her, to check. The way he checked everything: is this right, is this true? "Yes," she said before he asked. He kissed her again, and this time she put her hand on his jaw and he put his arm around her. And the fire burned low, and neither of them went inside for a very long time. The letter from Clan Chief Ragnoth Gorehorn arrived in the 8th week of summer, carried by a clan runner who clearly hated every step of the walk south, and left again so fast he was practically a smear on the horizon. The letter was written in clan runes on bark paper, and Dura read it at the table while Cyrus made breakfast, and the silence that fell over her was the kind that made him turn from the stove without her saying anything. "Your father, my father," she confirmed. She set the letter down with the careful precision of someone who would very much like to throw it at a wall. "The season is nearly over. He wants me home. He says the contract is fulfilled and my absence has gone on long enough, and that my duty is to the clan and not to a," she paused, translating, "a human's dirt patch in a valley full of people who hate our kind." Cyrus came and sat across from her and looked at the letter. "He's not wrong about the town," he said. "He's not wrong about many things," said Dura. "He is wrong about you." She looked at Cyrus squarely. "I want to tell him about us. I need to go back to the clan and tell him in person. If I send a letter, he will burn it and pretend it didn't come. How do you think he'll take it?" "Extremely badly," she said without hesitation. "My father fought in the border wars. He has opinions about humans that were formed on a battlefield and have not changed much since." She paused. "But he also loved my mother, and she changed his opinions about many things. He is not beyond reason. He is just initially very loud." Cyrus looked at her. "I'll come with you," he said. "Cyrus, you're not going back to tell your father something that hard alone," he said. "That's not how this works. I'll come." She looked at him for a long moment, and the mixture of gratitude and love and frustration on her face was a specific cocktail that she had never quite felt before and suspected she was going to be feeling for the rest of her life. "He might try to throw you out of the camp," she said. "Probably," Cyrus said. "Is he going to throw me more than once, or just the once?" "Don't be glib," she said, but her mouth was fighting a smile. "I'm serious," he said. "Once I can handle. More than once gets tiresome." She put her hand on the table, and he covered it with his, and his scarred fingers laced through hers with the easy certainty of a habit they had only recently acquired, but that already felt like it had always been there. "We go together," she said. "We go together," he agreed. They left the homestead in the early morning 5 days later, with the mule loaded with the things they'd need for a 3-day journey and 4 days in clan territory. Cyrus locked the cabin with the heavy iron latch and stood looking at the homestead for a moment, the good fence, the growing field, the solid barn, and Dura watched him do it with the knowledge that he was looking at something he'd built alone for 4 years, and that it was now, in a way that mattered to him, not alone anymore. "Ready?" she said. "Ready," he said, and they walked north. The walk to the Gorehorn clan territory was different from her first walk south. Then she had been alone and bracing herself. Now she walked beside someone, and they talked and were quiet and shared the food equally, and made camp the second night beside a creek in the forest where the light came through the canopy in long golden shafts. And she showed him how the clan built a one-night shelter from pine boughs, and he showed her a knot for the mule's line that was more reliable than the one she'd been using. And that night, by the campfire, she lay against his side under his coat, as well as her own, because the night was cold at this elevation. and she slept better than she had in 3 days of solo travel 3 months ago. The Gorehorn clan territory announced itself through the smell of cook fires and the sound of the training yard before it was visible. The deep, rhythmic impact sounds of sparring, the commands of the drill masters. Then the tree line opened and there was the war camp, which was the permanent summer residence of the clan, a spread of heavy hide tents and log-framed structures along a ridgeline, with the clan chief's longhouse at the center, which was actually built of stone with a sod roof and had been standing for 60 years. Eyes found them immediately. Dura had expected that. A returning clan daughter bringing a human man into the camp. It would have drawn attention if the eyes had not found them. She kept her chin level and her pace steady and let the attention roll over her. Cyrus walked at her side and matched her pace exactly and did not look nervous, which she respected. He looked around with an open, interested attention, at the construction of the tents, at the training yard where a dozen young warriors were working, at the cook fires with their iron pots. He was taking in information, not cataloging threats, and it was visible on his face, that distinction, and she thought it probably registered with the people watching them. Her father's second came out of the longhouse before they reached it. His name was Barg, and he was built like a door and had been her father's right hand for 15 years, and he looked at Dura with the complicated expression of a man who was very fond of someone who was about to cause him a great deal of administrative difficulty. "Dura," he said. "Barg," she said, "I need to see my father." "He knows you're here," said Barg. "He knew when you hit the forest edge." His amber eyes went to Cyrus, whom he examined with the professional economy of a man who had sized up opponents in battle, and what he was doing now was a different version of that, not threat assessment but character assessment. "This him." "His name is Cyrus Dalton," said Dura. "The homesteader," said Barg. "Yes," said Dura. Barg looked at Cyrus for another moment. "Come in," he said, and turned and went inside, and Dura and Cyrus followed. The longhouse was divided by a central fire pit, with Clan Chief Ragnoth Gorehorn seated on the far side of it in the carved wooden chair that was less a throne and more a very heavy seat that no one else sat in. He was a large orc, her father larger than most, with the gray starting to come in at his temples and in his beard, and arms that had done 40 years of hard living. He had his daughter's amber eyes, and they were fixed on Cyrus Dalton with an intensity that would have made most people take a step back. Cyrus did not take a step back. Dura stood beside him and addressed her father in the common tongue, because Cyrus needed to understand the conversation. "Father, I've come back to talk about the contract and about something else." "I can see something else," said Ragnoth, and his voice was the kind of voice that had been used to carry across battlefield noise for most of his adult life. He used it at conversational register now, but it still landed like a stone. "Who are you?" he said to Cyrus, "and what do you want in my clan's territory?" "I'm Cyrus Dalton," said Cyrus. "I want to speak with you honestly about your daughter if you'll allow it." "My daughter," said Ragnoth, "came to your homestead on a season's contract and has apparently decided not to leave. This is not what I agreed to." "It isn't," Cyrus acknowledged. "You agreed to a season. She stayed because she chose to. The choice was hers, freely made, and I want to be clear that I didn't ask her to stay until she had already decided to." Ragnoth's eyes went to Dura. "You chose to stay," he said in orc tongue, and she answered in kind. "I did," she said, "and I am choosing now. I'm not asking your permission, father, but I am asking for your understanding and your blessing if you can find it, because I know what it cost you when mother made her choice, and I know what it gave you, and I am asking you to remember that." The fire crackled in the pit between them. Ragnoth's jaw was tight. He looked at Cyrus for a long time with those amber eyes, the ones he'd given his daughter, and Cyrus met the look without flinching and without aggression, just met it steadily. "You will honor her," Ragnoth said finally, in common tongue, and it was not a question. "With everything I have," said Cyrus. "If you hurt her," said Ragnoth, "the Valley Passage rights become the least of your concerns." "Understood," said Cyrus. Ragnoth made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite agreement and was not quite refusal and was the closest he was going to get tonight to either. He gestured to Barg. "Give them a guest tent," he said. "We eat together tomorrow, all of us, and we will talk terms." He looked at Dura one more time and she saw it, the thing under the hardness, the thing that had always been under her father's hardness, which was fear for her and love of her, which she had never doubted even when everything else between them was difficult. "You are like your mother," he said quietly. "She also never asked permission." "No," said Dura, "she didn't." He looked away into the fire. "Go rest," he said. "We eat at dawn." The meal the next morning was the most loaded breakfast Dura could remember in her 23 years of life. The whole inner council of the clan was their 6 elders, Barg, 3 of her father's senior fighters and her 2 older sisters, who sat across the fire from Cyrus and examined him with the level assessment of women who had spent their lives evaluating things for structural integrity. Her eldest sister, Mora, spoke first. She addressed Cyrus directly and asked him without preamble what he had to offer and how he intended to secure Dura's position. Cyrus answered her directly. He talked about the homestead, the land, what it was and what it could be. He talked about the valley passage rights, which he committed to formalizing in a written and witnessed document rather than the verbal agreement currently in place. He talked about being honest that Thornfield Crossing was not a welcoming town, and that there would be difficulties, and that he was not going to lie to Mora or to Ragnoth about the fact that living as a mixed couple in that valley was not going to be smooth or easy. "Then why," said Mora, "would my sister choose it?" "You'd have to ask her," said Cyrus. "But I think you could also ask yourself why your mother chose what she chose, and whether the difficulty made the choice less right." Mora looked at him for a very long moment, and then she looked at Dura, and Dura looked back at her sister with all the quiet certainty she felt, and Mora let out a breath that was not quite a sigh and looked back at the fire. "He is not what I expected," Mora said to Dura in Orc tongue. "I know," said Dura. "I still have concerns." "I know that too." "But he looks at you like—" Mora stopped and started again and said, with the careful precision of someone who had chosen this word specifically, "like you matter, like you are the most important thing in the landscape wherever you are standing." She paused. Father looked at mother like that. Dura's throat was tight. "I know," she said for the 3rd time, barely above a whisper. The agreement they reached over the following 2 days was this: the Valley Passage rights formalized in writing, witnessed by Barg and 2 of the elders, with a copy kept by the clan and a copy by Cyrus. Dura's continued connection to the clan honored and protected. She would return at least once each year at the winter solstice, and the clan would be informed if there were any matters of health or difficulty. And Ragnoth's blessing, given not warmly, not without reservation, but given genuinely and without political calculation, which was the best and most honest kind of blessing Dura Gorehorn had to offer. He gave it on the 3rd morning, standing outside the longhouse in the early light with his arms crossed and his expression arranged in its permanent configuration of severe authority, and he looked at his daughter and said in Orc tongue, "Your mother would have liked him." "I think she would have," said Dura. "Come back in winter," he said. "Bring him. We will see if he survives a week in the camp." "He will," said Dura. Ragnoth made his inarticulate sound again. But she saw, as she and Cyrus turned to leave, that her father watched them go with the weight of a man who had fought his entire life against outcomes that were beyond his control, and had just chosen, this once, to lay the fight down. They walked south with the mountain air cold and clean around them, and somewhere in the first hour Cyrus took her hand and she let him, and they walked like that on the track through the forest, not talking much, and it was the kind of quiet that held rather than emptied. "Your father," Cyrus said eventually, "he's not what I expected either." "What did you expect?" "I don't know." Louder opposition. "Oh, that was him at restrained," she said. "He laughed. The look he gave me when I walked in, that is his normal face," said Dura. "He looks at everyone like that. It means nothing." "It meant considerable things," said Cyrus. "You did not step back," she said. She glanced at him sideways. He noticed. "Was I supposed to step back?" "Probably," she said. "Most people do." "I wasn't going to step back from your father," he said simply. I came there with you. Stepping back wasn't a thing I was going to do." She squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and they kept walking. The third season, and then the actual third season she had promised herself, unfolded across a year that was the richest she had ever known. The harvest was good. Better than good, the south field came in full and heavy, and with Dura's irrigation channel the western strip produced enough barley that they were able to sell a surplus at the Thornfield market, and use the coin to buy a second mule and 2 young goats, and the materials for a small root cellar behind the cabin. They dug the cellar together in the cool of the early autumn, working side by side in the good dark soil. And when they finished it and stood back to look at it, the satisfaction was not just practical. It was the satisfaction of something they had made together. The winter was hard. Winters in that valley were always hard, the mountain pressing cold air down and the snow coming in sideways off the ridge. They kept the homestead going through it, the mules in the barn, the goats in the small pen they'd added to the barn's south side, the root cellar full enough that they were never in real danger. They spent the long cold evenings at the plank table, Dura teaching Cyrus the Orc clan runes, and Cyrus teaching her a card game his father had played that involved elaborate bluffing and made Dura laugh out loud the first time she won through pure honest logic while Cyrus had been trying to misdirect her. And he looked at her with such delighted admiration that she laughed again just at his expression. They kept warm in the ways that mattered. The sleeping loft, which had been his alone, was theirs now, and on the coldest nights the cold was irrelevant. She learned the geography of his quietness, how he was quieter when he was worried, and how to tell the difference between that quiet and the comfortable, settled quiet of a man at rest. He learned the geography of her sharpness, how it was never cruelty, how it was a thing she'd built around herself for protection, and how she let it down around him in ways she didn't seem entirely conscious of, the softening of her voice on his name, the way she looked for him when he left a room. She made good on her promise, and they went to the clan for the winter solstice. Cyrus did survive the week barely, in the sense that the clan's idea of welcoming a guest seemed to involve testing them in every possible way without calling it testing. And he passed most of the tests through the combination of honesty, patience, and a complete refusal to be intimidated that seemed to be earning him a very slowly growing and very grudging respect from the clan's fighters. Ragnoth challenged him to an arm wrestling contest on the 4th day, which Ragnoth won easily because Ragnoth was a 60-year-old Orc clan chief built like a small mountain, and Cyrus shook out his arm afterward and said, "Right, so never planned to win that," which made Barg, standing nearby, produce something that was almost a laugh. Mora pulled Dura aside on the last day and said, "He told Joreth, one of the training fighters, gave him a hard time on the first day. He told him that he respected the training and the clan's strength, and then he said that strength meant more when it was used to protect rather than intimidate. And Joreth thought about that for a day and then went and apologized to the young apprentice he'd been bullying in the training yard. So," Mora paused, "he is still not what I expected." "He's not," Dura agreed. "I like him," Mora said, with the tone of someone admitting something against their better principles. "Do not tell him." "I won't," said Dura. She told him on the walk home, and he grinned and said nothing, which was exactly right. The second year brought new trouble from Thornfield. Fletcher and his particular brand of resentment had not gone away, and in the spring of the second year he organized what he called a community meeting, which was the Thornfield Crossing version of a tribunal, held in the yard in front of the trading post. The ostensible issue was the valley passage rights. Fletcher had gotten it into his head that the agreement Cyrus had formalized with the Gorehorn clan was a threat to the town, that having Orc traders and travelers on the valley road was an invitation to raiding. Cyrus got word of the meeting from the grain merchant, who sent it along more out of a guilt-born warning than any particular friendship, and he and Dura rode to Thornfield on the designated day and walked into the meeting yard together. The crowd was substantial, 30 or 40 townspeople, which was most of Thornfield on a spring weekday. Fletcher had positioned himself at the front with 3 other men who all shared his talent for turning fear into aggression. The trading post owner was there, and the blacksmith, and a dozen farmers and their families, and Elder Moswick, who had arranged the original contract, was standing to one side with an expression that suggested he was deeply regretting his involvement in all of this. Fletcher saw them come into the yard and started in immediately. He wanted the valley passage rights revoked. He called the agreement dangerous and reckless and pointed at Dura and called her a clan spy, which was so factually disconnected from reality that it was almost impressive. Dura stood in the yard with the crowd around them and did not react to the word spy, did not flinch, did not step back, and beside her Cyrus spoke. He spoke clearly and he spoke to everyone, not just Fletcher, to the farmers who were afraid, to the trading post owner who Cyrus knew did not personally object to trade but was worried about his standing in the town, to the elder women in the back who had children and were worried about the world those children were going to inherit. He said that the Gorehorn clan had held to every term of the Valley Agreement for the year it had been in formal writing, and that Orc traders on the Valley Road had bought grain and tools at the Thornfield market and spent coin in the trading post without a single incident. He asked, by name, the trading post owner if that was true, and the man said, grudgingly, that it was. He asked the grain merchant, who said the same. He stood in that yard with Dura beside him, and made the case not with anger but with evidence, fact by fact, the way you'd build a fence post by post, solid and specific. And then Dura spoke. She hadn't planned to, but Fletcher said something about the contract being a farce because no one asked the town's agreement, and something in her decided it was time. She said, in the clear, carrying voice she'd learned from a father who addressed camps of 300, "I am Dura Gorehorn. I came to this valley on a season's contract with no expectations and no welcome. I have worked this valley for a year and a half. I have put my hands in the same soil you put yours in. I have traded at the same market you trade at. I have fixed things that were broken and grown things that feed people." She looked around at the crowd, not at Fletcher, at the farmers, at the women in the back, at the young man near the post who was listening very hard with his arms crossed. "My mother negotiated the first border peace talks 20 years ago. Half the men in this town who didn't die in the border wars are alive partly because of that negotiation. I am not here to threaten anyone. I am here because this is where I have chosen to be." She stopped. The yard was quiet. Elder Moswick cleared his throat. "I think," he said, with the carefully measured tone of a man who had spent 40 years not saying things directly, "that the agreement has been good for this town. I think the evidence supports that. And I think that Miss Gorehorn has made her position quite plain." He looked at Fletcher. "I am not inclined to recommend revocation." Fletcher looked around for his support and found it softer than he'd expected. People were looking at their boots or at each other or back at Dura and Cyrus, recalculating. The young man near the post had uncrossed his arms. The motion to revoke the agreement failed. It wasn't a sweep. There were people who left that yard still unhappy, still afraid, still carrying the shape of the border wars like a wound that hadn't finished healing. But it failed, and Cyrus and Dura walked out of the meeting yard together and the crowd parted and let them through. On the road home, a mile out of Thornfield, Dura stopped walking. Cyrus stopped beside her. "You all right?" "I spoke at a human town meeting," she said. She was processing this in real time, in the yard, in front of all of them. "You did," he said. "You were very good." "Was I?" She turned to look at him, and what was on her face was something raw and complicated, not quite pride, not quite wonder, something in between. "My mother negotiated the first peace talks, and she did it mostly alone, and I used to think I could never do anything like that, that it was a thing only she could do, and I just—" She stopped, and Cyrus looked at her with all that careful, complete attentiveness, and he reached up and took her face in his hands gently, the way he did things when they mattered to him, and he said, "Your mother would be so proud of you." She pressed her forehead against his and closed her eyes, and his hands were warm on her face, and the road was empty and the mountain ridge was golden in the afternoon light, and she breathed. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it in those exact words, though she had said it in 20 other ways for the better part of a year. "I love you," he said, without hesitation, without any performance around it, just the simple fact of it. She kissed him on the empty road with the mountain light all around them, and it was not the first time by many months, but it was one of the important times, one of the ones that would stay clear in her memory when other things blurred. They married at the homestead at the beginning of the 3rd summer, which was the 3rd season she had stayed for, and it was the season she stopped counting. The ceremony was not the human church ceremony from Thornfield, and it was not the full Orc clan ceremony from the Gorehorn camp. It was its own thing, shaped from both and beholden to neither, which felt right. Ragnoth came with Mora and Barg and 6 others from the clan. Elder Moswick came from Thornfield, which surprised Dura, and the grain merchant and his wife, and the young man from the meeting yard whose name was Pell, and who had started showing up at the homestead market days to buy grain, and had gradually become something approximating a friend. 3 of the other valley farmers came, which was 3 more than Dura had expected. Cyrus had built a second table from planks he'd shaped over the winter, and they put both tables outside in the south field under the open sky, and there was food from both traditions. The Orc clan style roasted joints and grain cakes, and the human frontier pies and cheese, and the first barley ale from their own crop, and it was loud and a little chaotic and entirely itself. The vow they said to each other was simple. They had written it together at the plank table over 3 evenings, arguing mildly about the wording and eventually finding it. It was, "I choose you. I will keep choosing you. In the hard seasons and the good ones, in the years I know about and the ones I don't yet. You are my home." She said it in common tongue and then said it in Orc tongue, and he had learned enough of the clan runes by then to follow it. And when she finished, he said it back to her in common tongue and stumbled over 3 words of the Orc tongue but recovered gamely. And the laugh that ran through the gathered people, Orc and human alike, was warm and inclusive, and the exact sound she had wanted her wedding to make. Ragnoth embraced her when the vows were done, and it was the particular embrace of a large, formidable man who has not yet entirely made peace with the shape of his feelings, which was to say it was a bit stiff and very brief, and she could feel the emotion behind it like heat behind stone. "Be well," he said. "I will," she said. He shook Cyrus's hand with the kind of grip that was probably also a final assessment, and then he looked at both of them together in the summer field with the mountain ridge behind them, and his expression was something she had not seen on his face since her mother was alive. He looked, she thought, a little like a man who had learned to be surprised by life again. The 3rd year and into the 4th, the homestead grew. The root cellar was extended. A second barn bay was added for a small milking cow they traded for at the autumn market. The grain merchant and Cyrus formalized a standing arrangement that gave them consistent grain sales, and the merchant a reliable local source, which was good for both of them. Pell brought his sister to the homestead to help with the planting in the 2nd spring, and the sister, whose name was Wynne, turned out to be an excellent hand with plants and not bad with a hammer either, and they began paying her 2 days a week, which gave Dura and Cyrus the first regular help the homestead had ever had. Dura went to the clan for the winter solstice every year. Cyrus came most years, and in the years he came, his relationship with the clan deepened in the slow, solid way of things that have to earn their place. Barg taught him 3 clan wrestling holds on the 2nd visit. By the 4th visit, Jorath, the fighter who'd been rude on the 1st visit, and had apparently been thinking about what Cyrus said ever since, asked Cyrus to spar with him, which was the highest form of respect the training yard offered. Cyrus lost comprehensively and thoroughly, and with a cheerful grace that everyone in the training yard liked better than if he'd won. "He's improving," Ragnath told Dura on the fourth winter visit, watching Cyrus in the training yard. "He's very determined," said Dura. "He's also getting better at the runes," said Ragnath, which was the deepest compliment he was likely to offer regarding a human learning the clan's written language. "He practices every night," said Dura. Ragnath was quiet for a moment and then said, "He loves you very thoroughly." "Yes," said Dura simply. "He does." Her father said nothing more, but he watched Cyrus in the training yard with the expression of a man who was revising old conclusions, and that was, for Ragnath Gorehorn, a considerable thing. The child came in the fourth year. She was born in the early spring, a half-orc boy they named Aldrich, which was from Cyrus's lineage, with the middle name Ranther, which was from Dura's mother's name reworked into a form that carried both the clan's meaning and the common tongue sound. He came into the world in the cabin that Cyrus's father had built, and Cyrus held him for the first time with the expression of a man who has just encountered something that utterly defeats all his systems of preparation, which was to say, he looked overwhelmed and incandescent with love in equal measure. And when Dura looked at the two of them, her husband and her son, the man she had stayed for and the life she had chosen, she felt something that had no precise word in either language and did not need one. Aldrich had her amber eyes and Cyrus's dark hair, and the faint greenish cast of mixed ancestry that was, she thought, a beautiful and singular thing. Ragnath held his grandson at the winter solstice of that year, was handed him by Dura with the calm certainty of a woman who knows her father better than he knows himself, and stood with the baby for a long moment in the firelight of the longhouse, and his face did something unfamiliar and complicated, and then he said, in a voice that was very quiet for a man who normally sounded like a physical event, "He looks like his grandmother's eyes." "He does," said Dura. Ragnath said nothing else about the child for the rest of the visit, but he held Aldrich 3 more times, and by the last evening he was doing it with an ease that suggested the practice had been very quietly going on all along. The homestead continued to grow in the years that followed. The Valley Passage rites, formalized and witnessed and now long established, had become the mundane infrastructure of daily commerce orc traders and human merchants using the same road without drama, which was the best possible outcome, the one where the extraordinary thing becomes ordinary. There were still people in Thornfield who didn't like it, who carried their fear as something near sacred and wouldn't put it down. But there were also now people in Thornfield who had done business with the Gorehorn clan's traders for 3 years, and who had come to the homestead's harvest market, and shared a meal and shaken hands and argued over grain prices, and found that the world had not ended as a result. Pell, who had started as a passing acquaintance and become a genuine friend, told Cyrus one evening while they were working on a new stretch of fence, "You know what the difference is, in town? It's that people can see it now. You and Dura and the kid and the place. People can see that it's real and it works and nothing terrible happened. It's harder to be afraid of something once it's just Tuesday, you know. Once it's just someone you see at market. It's a slow thing," Cyrus said. "Everything real is," said Pell, "but it's moving." Dura found Aldrich, when he was 3, attempting to dig in the bean garden with a stick, and sat down in the dirt beside him, and taught him how to do it properly with a real digging tool, crouched next to him in the warm summer earth with his small hands mimicking hers, and she thought about her mother's hands in the irrigation channel when Dura was 12, the way knowledge moved forward, and felt the full weight and grace of it. She looked up from the garden and found Cyrus in the doorway of the cabin watching them, and the look on his face was the one she'd seen for 4 years now, the one Mora had described as the look of a man for whom she was the most important thing in the landscape. It had not dimmed. If anything, it had deepened, settled into something more permanent and more sure than it had been in the beginning, the way a river settles into its bed after the spring flood and runs truer for it. She smiled at him, and he smiled back, and Aldrich banged his small digging tool on the ground with great satisfaction, and the mountain ridge stood above them all in the clear summer light, and the spring ran its old, true course along the eastern edge of the homestead, and the south field grew, and the fence held, and the root cellar was full. There was a late afternoon toward the end of that fourth summer when Cyrus came in from the east field, and Dura was baking flatbread on the iron plate over the stove. She had grown, over the years, genuinely fond of the process of making bread, which was something she would not have predicted about herself when she arrived on that rutted wagon track with a clan contract, and a bruised jaw, and Aldrich was asleep in the small crib they'd built in the corner. And the light through the cabin's south window was long and amber and warm, and Cyrus came in and stopped in the doorway and breathed in the smell of bread and wood smoke and the specific domestic peace of the place. And she turned and looked at him over her shoulder and said, "Good day." "Good day," he said. "The east field drainage is working the way you said it would. I told you it would." "You did," he said, and came across the cabin to her, and stood behind her and put his arms around her and pressed his mouth to the side of her neck, and she leaned back into him with the ease of long practice, the ease of people who have learned each other's geography well enough to navigate it in the dark. "I was thinking," he said against her hair. About the fact that you came here for one season," he said. "I did," she said. "And you stayed for 3, he said, "and then more." "And then more," she agreed. "Why?" said. Not as a challenge, not with any insecurity behind it, but with the curious, genuine attention of a man who, even after all this time, wanted to understand her, just wanted to keep understanding her. She turned in his arms and looked at him, at the face she knew now better than any other, the dark eyes and the jaw and the lines at the corners of his eyes that had deepened in the years of weather and work and laughter, and she thought about the question honestly. "The tea was terrible," she said. "I stayed to fix the tea." He laughed and she laughed, and it was the kind of laughter that had lived in the cabin for years now, that had soaked into the log walls and the plank table and the stone of the hearth, that Aldrich would grow up breathing without knowing it. "Dura," he said when the laughter had settled into warmth. "Yes," she said, "I would like, if you're agreeable, to spend the next 40 years making terrible tea for you." 40, she said. "That is a significant commitment." 40 at minimum, he said. I was leaving room for more. She put her hands on his face, her orc-green hands against his jaw in the amber light of the south window, and she looked at him with everything she had, all 4 years of it, all the seasons, all the hard mornings and the good evenings and the Thornfield meeting yard and the clan longhouse and the fence and the channel and the first kiss by the fire and every moment since, and she said, "Yes, I am agreeable to that." He kissed her, and the flatbread did not burn only because Dura had enough experience with both bread and Cyrus to have pulled it off the heat first, and Aldrich slept in his crib with the even, trusting breath of a child who has never known a night that was not safe. And the mountain ridge outside the south window was turning to rose gold in the setting sun, which happened every clear evening, and which Cyrus and Dura had watched together too many times to count and still looked at every time. She had come expecting 1 season. His kindness had made her stay for 3, and then for more, and then for the kind of more that doesn't have a number, that is just all of it, every season, every morning, every flatbread and terrible tea and mule and bean vine, and winter storm and spring thaw and child's laugh and husband's voice saying her name in the dark. Every single particular and unrepeatable moment of the life that she had chosen, and that had chosen her back. The homestead stood in its valley under the mountain ridge, and the spring ran true, and the fence held, and the field grew. And in the autumn, when the first frost came and the goats crowded into the barn and the root cellar was full, and the mule regarded the world with its customary profound philosophical detachment, Dura Gorehorn sat on the step of the cabin she called home and sharpened her field knife with the evening's last light on her face. And Cyrus came and sat beside her with 2 mugs of tea that was still not particularly good, and Aldrich was between them with his small legs dangling off the step and his amber eyes watching the first star appear above the ridge. Cyrus set a mug beside her hand and she picked it up, and it was warm. "Still bad," she said after a sip. "Working on it," he said. She leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her, and Aldrich leaned into her other side, and the star above the ridge was joined by another, and the mountain did what mountains do, stood, enduring, indifferent to seasons and contracts and prejudices and fear, indifferent to everything except the long, patient fact of being there. And below it the valley held its breath in the early dark, and in it the homestead held its light, and everything that had been built there, by hand and by choice and by the repeated daily act of deciding to stay, was solid and warm and real, and would be there when morning came.